you know, we still need the stories, whether we read modern novels or not. It's like, we need that connection, whether it's with our elders or with our kids. We pass these stories on as something precious. For me personally, it's probably just the unknown. I've always been drawn more to the unknown and whatever the beyond of normal life. So I would actually go out and look for these. We would go to haunted houses. We would go to haunted areas of the cities, see what was going on. Yeah. Now, whatever that comes from, I don't know, but it kept life interesting.
It was almost like an escape.
Definitely an escape. Family life was not a happy life, so that was an escape. Definitely.
Hey, welcome to the Floaties for Krakens podcast. I am your host, Camille Maria Costa, and it is a brilliant day to be monstrous. Hey, Cuttlefish. Welcome back to Season 3, Episode 9 of Floaties for Krakens. Happy November, everybody. My gosh, this month flew. Every month has been flying by so quickly. I can't believe it's already the end of 2024. What is even happening? Look, I just hope the fall has been extremely kind to you. And if not, I hope that at the very least, you've been extremely kind to yourself. And hey, it's never too late to start right now. We have an amazing episode in store for you all today from a really, really, really incredible person. And not only is he like the nicest person on the planet, but his wealth of knowledge in the world of monster studies is massive, and it is so clear that he is in the field that he is supposed to be in. David J. Puglia, Ph.D., is Professor and Deputy Chairperson in the English Department at Bronx Community College of the City University of New York, where he teaches courses in folklore. He is the editor of Contemporary Legend and the author of 4 books on legend and folklore, including the Brian McConnell award-winning North American Monsters, a Contemporary Legend Casebook, which is an incredibly great book. That's actually where I first heard of David. And of course, we both share the same alumni, WKU Folk Studies Department. So he's freaking cool, okay? David, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. Ever since I saw you speak about monsters 2 years ago, you've inspired me to trust in the monster and be proud of it. Thank you so much for handling our research, our field, and our monsters with such kindness and such grace. The spooky world is so incredibly lucky to have you, and I'm excited to see what other projects you have on the horizon. Just a couple of content warnings for this episode. A few mentions and discussions of physical abuse, animal death, murder, mental health difficulties, racism, and generational trauma in this episode. So do what you need to do to feel safe. Well, without further ado, ladies and cuttlefish, let me introduce to you folk studies programs for Goatmen. Well, hello again, David.
Hi, Camille. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for having me. Appreciate being here.
Oh, of course. I am so excited. I'm excited to just chat with you on like a human level, because I was so inspired for people that don't know, and David's going to talk about what he does and all of the amazing monster work he's involved with. But I first met David, gosh, how long ago now? When was it? 2021, 2022?
Those parties all kind of blend together. I think it was.
I know.
Yeah, but I think it was 2 years ago.
2 years ago, at our alma maters, WKU, Western Kentucky University, he was doing an incredible monster presentation celebrating the 50th anniversary of the folk studies program. And I was like, oh my God, I got so excited. This is so cool. And yeah, I'm just really excited. And thank you so much, David, for agreeing to be on the show.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me here, and thanks for being interested in this little area of the world that maybe not everyone is interested in, but those of us who are passionate. So it's good to
Oh, that's right.
meet the other kindred spirits.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think your work is really going to spark something cool in everyone. So, but before I get even further, tell us, David, who are you? What do you do? What do you like to do? Why what's this whole monster thing?
So I'm David Puglia. I was a government and politics major at the University of Maryland when I had like completed all of my required courses to graduate with the BA. So I just had to fill up my last semester. And I'd always wanted to take there's a class called Dinosaurs at the University of Maryland, and there's another class
Oh my God.
called Trampoline. But I couldn't get into any of those classes because the super seniors, the people who've been there for 5 years, they got to register before us because they had more credits. So all that was left that I thought looked cool was this class called Introduction to Folklore, and so with Barry Lee Pearson. And so I signed up. I said, I'll take that. I'll see what's going on. So this is the fall semester of my senior year. It's fall semester of my senior year, and I got into that, and that's actually the first time I heard of the Goatman, which we will talk about later. And I liked government and politics, but I didn't really see a future in it. But as soon as I got into this introduction to folklore class, I was like, I could see a future in this, which is a strange thing to think, that I could see a future in something that I was unaware was even a career possibility. But I still, and then I actually did type in to the internet, into Google or whatever was being used at the time. This was 2006. I typed in like folklorists, can you be one? And the Western Kentucky University website came up, and it was actually at least for 2006, it was a really good website, and it seemed to have some professional folks. And there's the sock monkey tradition, and I really liked the sock monkey tradition because I said, if a group of people has a tradition like pinning sock monkeys on their graduates, this must be a tight, long-standing in-group. And so, never having been to Bowling Green, or I think I had been to Kentucky, but never been to Bowling Green, not really know anything about folk studies. Just having taken this class, and then I signed up for the follow-up class in the spring semester with the same professor. I was like, you know what? We're going to Western Kentucky. And it's been ever since then, I've been on the folklore path. Then I did the MA in folk studies at Western Kentucky, and something that will come up later when I try to explain why I decided I needed to study the Goatman. I worked in the folklife archives at Western Kentucky with Jonathan Jeffries in the Kentucky Library. Another thing that I didn't know it existed, and then I got there, and I said, you know what, this is awesome. I like a folklife archives. So I got experience into what it meant to be a folklorist, got my master's in folklore or in folk studies at Western Kentucky, worked in the folklife archives, and then went to Penn State to do Ph.D. technically in American Studies, but with a focus in folklore with Simon Bronner. And that's where I started working on the Goatman. And as I got into looking at this regional monster, then I started asking myself, as I progressed, like, who is the equivalent Goatman in the other 49 states? And I started thinking about that in 2011, and then like 12 years later, finally the casebook comes out, where the attempt is to explain who the Goatman is but it's not really all 50 states, but who the local regional monsters of the United States are, according to the folklorists who have looked into them over the years. So yeah, now I'm a professor at Bronx Community College at the City University of New York, which is at University Heights in the Bronx in New York. And I live in upstate New York, north of New York City, and I'm sitting in my house right now. Talking to you about monsters.
Isn't that incredible, everyone? Like, I think, people don't realize the cool stuff that you can study in school, and the cool classes, and the wonderful mentors and people that can spark a completely different journey for you. I'm much like you, David. I accidentally took a folklore class and was like, holy crap, I didn't know you could do that. I was just like you. And I think that's so awesome
that you like, I don't know, you took a piece of your home and like a piece of who you are as a human all the way with you, like to follow you through this trajectory of your monster career. I think that is so sick and so awesome.
Never thought about
And
it like
you're
that. Yeah, I took a friend. I took a friend with me. A friend in the form of a scary monster. But yeah, a friend that traveled with me
yes,
and probably helped me out in my career along the way. So thank you,
100%.
Goatman.
No, yes, yes, thank you, Goatman. I mean, it's so cool. And I think, like, as you mentioned, right, there unfortunately are a lot of people that don't think monster, like, they don't take monsters seriously, or monster studies, or that genre. People see it as childlike or childish, which I find it very offensive that they use that as like a pessimistic term, because children are so much smarter than we will ever be. But like, I don't know, I think it's really cool that, again, you brought the Goat Man, right, into this level almost of prestige in that way. That's what I think is so cool about folklife archives and archives in general. And then, taking things into thesis writing or book writing or what have you, is being like, yeah, look at this, look at how important this is, I'm putting these words on paper. And it's awesome, like, you get to meet so many cool people because of stuff like that.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right about that triviality barrier, and I can't argue against it. That I can see when you're going to have to fill out like a 10-year file to show how serious of a researcher you are. It can be a little
Yeah,
scary putting down, that you're what is seen as like a cryptozoologist or something like that. You're seen as
exactly.
a fluffy monster researcher. But I think we're lucky as folklorists that monsters or cryptids or any sort of supernatural entities can be studied much the same way as any other part of folklore can be studied. So we can do it in a manner that I think is very much accepted among our discipline, and perhaps can be seen as respectable even in
Yeah,
broader circles.
absolutely. And it's so cool. I love that. That's so awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you a question a little further back though, David. What was like your first introduction to the world of the spooky or monsters in that way?
Yeah,
How did you get into
that's a
it?
good question. So I think I don't. I've been asked this question before, and I think I don't have as good of an answer as some other people because I started later in life. When I try to think back, like, okay, what did I like? Um, I know my first introduction just to like monsters in my life was Bloody
Yeah.
Mary, uh, and Bloody Mary in the Mirror. And like it wasn't anything like Alan Dundee's Bloody Mary. It didn't have anything to do with like menstruation,
Right.
or my coming of
Right.
age as a woman. It was simply the earliest like scary legend that I remember that certainly had an direct effect on my life. And my version of Bloody Mary, um,
Yeah.
the Frederick, Maryland variant that we were aware of, is you. All it was if you had to be alone in a dark room at midnight and say Bloody Mary 3 times while looking into the mirror, and she would appear. Uh, and that was so scary to me that my mother's
Yeah.
like an antiquer, and we had this this beautiful dresser with this ornate mirror, and the mirror had to be removed from my room because
Oh,
the piece had to
David.
be
Oh
destroyed, and
no.
the mirror removed from my room because I was so afraid of Bloody Mary. So that's the furthest back I can remember as far as a legend actually affecting me. I
Yeah.
also love, like, my favorite genre of horror film is slashers, which I think, especially like the cryptid Cropsy, or really
Mm,
not the cryptid, the monster Cropsy, and several other contemporary legends, I think directly affected the slasher craze and the slasher craze that went back into legends. So those two things I can identify
wow.
from my childhood. But then beyond that, it gets kind of nerdy or nerdier because my interest in monsters, cryptids, and I guess just supernatural legend in general actually comes from being interested in academic folklore first and saying, I'm interested in this stuff, but people don't seem to be applying it to this other area as much as I think it should be, especially when I go out there and
Mm,
tell people what I do or what I'm trying to do. And that's the first example that comes to their mind. Yet it doesn't seem to
yeah.
be being addressed all that regularly, or at least these particular ones in my regional area haven't been addressed by folklorists. Maybe they have been by journalists or just
Right.
layman enthusiasts. But not by folklore. That's kind of how I got into them being interested in Goatman. It's like, okay, let's see, can we apply these theories that folklorists report to
Right.
be true, these principles, to the study of legendary monsters? And ultimately, I think the answer to that is yes. And somehow that's what I was most excited about.
That's awesome. That's so cool. Oh my gosh. Okay, okay. I'm going to go chronologically. So, first, with the introduction of Bloody Mary, that is so wild. That, I mean, it's terrifying, right?
I'm so
Like, and
scared.
I know we'll go into, yes, and we'll go into, breaking down what a legend is, but, hearing stories like that, and then the included localization of these scary stories being like, oh yeah, it can happen to you, at any given moment. You just have to do XYZ, is so freaking terrifying for a young kid. And it's wild how kids like partake in legend tripping, and they do it together to like make each other scared and all this stuff. And oh my gosh, that moving your mirror, I think, was a very smart move.
Yes, the whole social dynamics there are very much true.
Oh geez. But yes, and then kind of your exploration of slasher films, which is so awesome. You're braver than I am. Slasher films freak me out so much. But I mean, the monsters in those films are so fantastic, and I don't know, they're just painted so brilliantly. And I think it's really amazing, that you were like, no, we need to apply these folklore theories to these monsters and to these specific regional monsters that I grew up with. Put them on the map, and I want you all to see those parallels and how they reflect. That's so cool. What was kind of your hope to get out of, like, once you started to be like, okay, I'm going to do this folklore thing in the academic sphere, I want to explore the goat man? How did you figure out how you wanted to do that, right? Like, did you want to collect oral histories? Did you want to interviews? How did you kind of go about that
Yeah,
process?
so what I did with the Goatman is like how I got started. So I like,
Yeah.
well, let's start with what's already out there. So I knew about the Goatman because I had lived in Prince George's County, which is ultimately where his home. I'd heard about it. I knew that it was at least an authentic enough in the oral tradition that people were vaguely aware of this name and kind of where this entity lived. Then I was like, okay, but there's only so much I could get from oral interviews in 2010. It
Yeah.
seemed that the tradition had kind of died out at that point, not in the name or the idea, but in the like the details of this legend. So I said, let's read everything I can about what's already out there. And so I did that. There's several authors who've written quite a bit about Goatman. I think the best being an author named Mark Opsasnik, who
Okay.
is a local to the area. He's written several interesting books, and he's written about the Goatman. He was from Bowie, which is going to be one of the locations that's prominent in the Goatman legend. And I
Yeah.
read all about it, and the thing that I noted that it was quite well researched. There was a lot of information about how the Goat Man had appeared in newspaper articles and how he had caused a frenzy and like where the
Yeah.
purported locations had been. But what I noticed was not actually in there was the files in the Maryland Folklife Archive. The authors would mention that there was a Maryland Folklife Archive, which is just the Folklife Archive at the University of Maryland, much like the one at Western Kentucky, but
Yeah.
nobody was actually going into those files. And I said, you know what? This is where my contribution begins. I was at that point a folklife archivist with the experience of maybe 1 or 2 years, uh, you know, but enough that I knew what a folklife archive was. I knew how to
Oh
access
yeah.
one. I guess even just I knew they existed is probably something many people don't even know exists. And so I said, I'm gonna try to figure out what's going on with the Goat Man by going to the Maryland Folklife Archives, digging through and finding every reference to the Goat Man from the beginning of the Maryland Folklife Archives to present, and see
Whoa.
how can we add to this story by finding the work of folklorists. Now, these were undergraduate folklorists who had taken just
Sure.
one class in folklore, but they were being mentored by professional folklorists, and they were
Right.
many of these files were very impressive. They were giving it their best shot.
Yeah.
So I went in there and I found this, what amounts to somewhat of a story that you can embed within this bigger story of the Goatman that starts in 1971 and flies through to the 90s in the Folklife archives. So, um, what I was, I guess, most excited about is this idea that, this somewhat nerdy, definitely professional folklorist thing, the Folklife archives could add to a story that people were already interested in. But I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself. I probably should say what the story is before we then talk about what the.
Right. No, that's okay. I asked because I was very curious too. That's so cool. Okay. Before we get even into what the Goatman is, because I want to talk about your book a little bit, but what, David, and this might be complicated, but what do you think is a monster in your
Oh
own
no, I'm
words?
glad you asked me that. So I have a whole so now we're talking about the North American Monsters Casebook. I go on a long rant about this because and the reason I do is because some of the, I don't know what we say, uh, less honest authors, they will just kind of skip over the definition of a monster altogether because it's a very difficult thing. Some of the
Right.
more interesting, um, and more honest authors will just outright admit that they don't have a good definition of what a monster is, and that's appreciated as well. Because I was writing an academic casebook on legendary monsters,
Right.
I figured I had to at least offer something. We work with definitions. I got to give this a shot. So I didn't attempt to define monster. I attempted to define legendary monster. So
Mm.
my definition ultimately came to any sort of frightening or unsettling creature, real or imaginary, believed or not believed, that at the time of the telling is purported but not verified to exist. So this
Huh.
quite a broad definition, but the problem with trying to go any more specific, in my opinion, than that is there's almost an instant example of a monster out there, something that the folk refer to as a monster or a cryptid that will go against that. So, for example, it's something that's purely imaginary. That one gets dropped immediately because there's several
Yeah.
examples of just things we call animals these days that were treated as monsters upon either first encounter with them because some sort of colonists were unaware of this particular
Mm.
of the native flora and fauna, or just because it's
Mm.
imbued by the local people, by the indigenous people with special attributes. And the believed or not believed, how can you even say if the teller believes it or not believes it? We have examples all the way from very sacred renditions of telling about legendary monsters all the way up to charlatans in like that Scooby-Doo style that are making up monsters to keep people away. Those all
Yeah.
fall under the legendary monster banner. So I think it's important to
Yeah.
have some sort of definition, but also admit that it's going to be very broad, and you have to be very careful when trying to exclude too much from the definition. I guess the one thing that was most important to me for just this book, the North American Monsters Casebook that we're briefly touching on, is that I did want them to be mostly physical entities because I felt
Okay.
that more like ethereal or ghostly, or I guess what I think of when I think say the word supernatural entities. I thought they'd been better covered elsewhere in folklore
Sure.
and actually were slightly more respectable. Something that maybe
Mm.
other disciplines are more comfortable with. And so I
Mm.
wanted to stick to the physical. So a monster that supposedly you could go up and touch. If you could get close to it, you could touch it with
You
your
could.
hand
Right.
and not go metaphorical either. Stay literal because you could use the word monster to mean all sorts of things. Like, oh, that
Of
project
course.
has become a monstrosity, or those people, or that guy is a monster. But so we're being
Right.
physical, we're being literal, but we're being broad.
Yeah. Oh, you covered all the bases. That's the true academic in you. I feel like that's perfect. You're absolutely right. And I mean, I think that's been the most fun about this show is asking the guests that question. And every single guest's answer is completely different, right? They see things differently. They have their own lens on stuff.
Understandably so
And
too. Understandably so.
right, as you just mentioned, right? The definition is continuously alive almost. It ebbs and it flows and it changes just depending on the context of whoever's talking about it. But I love that you used your specific, like, this is what I focused on specifically in this book. And I remember too, I was doing research on La Llorona, and I remember my thesis advisor, Dr. Kate Horgan, was like, all right, Camille, so is she a ghost? Is she a monster? What are we doing? What are we doing here? And I was like, I'm going to argue that she could be both. And it was like a fun exploration of like, I want to show how she could be both in this way. But it also got people very confused. Some people were like, no, ghosts are different, right, than monsters. They have to be treated as separate entities. All these different things. How can one creature be both? And I think I am really glad that you mentioned, like, no, I'm focusing specifically on physical monsters, even though fully knowing, like, the word monster, the term monster can manifest metaphorically for people, depending on how they feel about something.
And I think you're right.
So I think that's
There's a bunch of examples where they can be both. They can be both, and they can definitely be both.
which makes it confusing, and I realize that. I totally own that. But I think that's what makes it fun. I think it's really fun, um, seeing how people define it and explore it, and how it changes for some people sometimes too throughout their lives.
Right. Right.
Okay, before I ask you about this book, are you willing to define what a legend is? Because I know you say like legendary monsters, right? But I'm curious if you wouldn't mind defining legend, especially in the world of cryptids and cryptozoology too.
Yeah, so I think I like to keep legend really simple. I think a legend is just a narrative retold.
Yeah,
If we could just keep it, it's just a narrative retold. It's not the original narrative,
yeah.
it's the narrative retold. So when it comes to this specific subject that we're discussing today, when it becomes to legendary monsters, the legend retold is frequently because you're hearing not from the original witness. Now,
Hmm.
we can hear from the original witness. We can have an anecdote or a memory or whatever we want to call it. But if the story is good enough, it's going to then become a uh, a legend simply for that reason. But I like to
Right.
keep it really very simple, just a narrative retold.
Perfect. Couldn't have said it better myself. I love that. And I think what's great is that everybody has heard a legend or told a legend or seen a legend. Like, they're so just easily accessible and available to people. You grow up with them with your family, or as you mentioned, right? Like, you heard Bloody Mary maybe at school or with your friends, right? Like, it's really crazy, how everybody can attach to a legend, I think, in some way. And then, seeing monsters in this format, seeing those main characters, right, of these stories passed down is really, really cool, really sick. Okay, so what is this book? Tell us all about this book,
The book.
David.
Oh, the book. Okay. The North American Monsters Casebook.
That's right.
Okay. So the North American Monsters Casebook came out of Goatman, which we'll talk about later. And so the idea was simply what doing my Goatman research. I wanted to know who are the equivalent monsters in the other states. Eventually Goatman kind of becomes like the state monster. Like states have their state. So in Maryland, we have our state flower. It's the black-eyed Susan. We also have
Love it.
our state sport of lacrosse. We have our state
Yeah.
monster of the the goat man. I wanted to know like what just my initials. I was like, okay, what are the 49 others? I wanted to know this one because I'm interested in it. It was just of interest to me. And you can kind of find something like that. I'm sure you've seen these, Camille. I'm sure that your listeners have as well. That people will post like a map of the United States, and they'll fill in each one of the states with a particular cryptid or a particular legendary monster. They're very fun.
So
And
fun.
so, like the New Jersey obviously always gets the Jersey Devil. Maryland
Right.
always gets the Goat Man. Um, the 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 thing that then I wanted from a scholarly perspective. It's like, okay, I want this because it's fun, but I also want this because I want to know how to do my thing on the Goatman. What's the equivalent that's been
Mm,
done elsewhere? As a young academic, this is what I need. I need to be able to see how some people have done this elsewhere. And then,
right.
so keep in mind as I as I recount the history of this book, this started in probably 2010, and the book comes out
Okay.
in 2022. So this is like 12 years. And what I found was that there's been some work done on
Yeah.
legendary monsters by folklorists, some good work, but it wasn't necessarily always in the Journal of American Folklore. It wasn't necessarily
Mm,
always in even folklore journals. It was sometimes in local folklore journals, regional folklore journals, journals that are just folklore adjacent,
mm,
journals that were not necessarily digitized in any way. So unless you
mm.
already knew about this or could find an obscure reference,
Yeah.
or maybe you do find the reference, but there's only 3 copies left of it in the world, and you would have to. And they don't circulate journals, so you would
Right.
have to go to Missouri to find this one copy left of this journal. So I said, you know what? I want to try to identify the most similar uh, writing that's been done that's similar to this idea of like trying to trace down the goat, the folklore of the goat man in Maryland. What else has
Yeah.
been done? And then let's try to keep it specific. So what else has been done in North America, and can we showcase that? So over
Mm,
those the next decade, I tried to hunt down, and I eventually found um, there's 19 chapters. 5 of them I commissioned to fill out holes that I thought I saw, and that would here's my math skills. The other 14 were articles that I found in disparate journals, chapters
wow.
of books that were out of print all over the United States. And then the goal was to put them together so that you could see the academic study of legendary monsters themselves. But then
Yeah.
also, my goal that I hope I succeed in was to arrange them in such a way, in such an order, but then also with um, a prologue written by me or a foreword to each one to show how they kind of fit into this bigger idea of contemporary legend scholarship. So going back to my nerdy original point, I got into this because I was interested in the scholarship. I was like, how could this be applied to it? So
Right.
in such a way that if you read through, okay, I'm interested in monsters. If you read through, my goal was at the end, you're also getting a taste of this is how legend scholars view legend in general, and you're just looking at it through the lens of monster. Um,
Wow.
that was the ultimate goal. It came together. Finally came out in 2022.
Gosh.
Um,
Yes.
and yeah, North American Monsters: A Contemporary Legend Casebook.
Which we'll be linking all of this in our
Right.
description box. So, oh my gosh, 12 years. 12 years. That's so incredible. I know this was a couple of years ago, but
Oh,
congratulations
thank
still
you.
because that's
Yeah,
such a that's such a
feels like
feat.
it.
I know. It's all like you said melting together.
And it was
But
it was really fun to put together because you have to. Actually, I don't know if you have to, but I wanted to have the permission of every single author to have the. Technically, I guess I could just have the permission of the presses or whoever wherever they published. But I wasn't comfortable with that. I wanted to have the permission of every
good for
single living
you.
author. So I got in touch with each one of them, which was awesome because then that turns into stories of how, just like you're asking me, like how did you even get into this? And so, just for
Right.
example, the eminent folklorist Jim Leary, he kicks off. He has the Boondock Monster, which is the first chapter in the book because it goes
Right.
chronological, and so he worked on that research, that chapter, I think, and published it 15 years before I was even born. So, so we're working,
Whoa.
the first 4 or 5 chapters are all the same. They're working on things
Right.
before the editor of the book is even born. They've already, researched and published. So I like something that's that old. But then also I realized, because you're asking me some interesting questions where I'm like, oh, that was 10 years ago. I was asking them the same questions so I could, write up the forward to each chapter. Some
Yeah.
of these things are half a century ago. So It's just fun to be able to ask scholars about it, but also impressive that they can remember any sort of detail from work that they've done
Oh
that
my
long ago.
gosh. It's clearly work that they're very passionate about, and that they've dedicated so much of their lives to.
Right.
And I'm sure they were so honored to talk to you and be like, I would love to be a part of this awesome. Cause what a cool collection. Like it's so fascinating. Such a good idea, David. And I'm so glad that you did it. It's such an important it's just so vital, I think, in the monster world, academic or not. I think people can learn so much about um, being proud, I think, of the monsters that make you feel like home and that you grew up listening to. And, as I always love to say, right, talking about monsters gets us a little closer to talking about ourselves. So I think that's what's so neat about this book. So yeah, great book. We're linking it, by the way, just so everybody knows. Um, okay, down to the nitty gritty then. Who is the Goat Man? More specifically, the Goat Man of Maryland, David.
Okay, so the Goatman of Maryland. We should start this story. I guess we start the story just sometime before 1971. Sometime before
Right.
1971, there's a vague idea in Prince George's County, and I know you all that are listening are mostly probably not from Maryland, so I'll explain what Prince George's County is. Maryland and Virginia meet in a place called Washington, D.C., which is the capital of the United States. Somewhere to the east, in the Maryland part of that, is where this story is going to take place, like just to the east, outside of Washington, D.C. At least it's certainly during that time, a rather rural area outside on the Maryland side of the border of Washington, D.C. There's this vague idea, or I guess I can't even really comment because we don't have exact evidence, but there is a goat man out there. We know
Yeah.
this. We know this because one, the first folklore file we find references Goatman before there's any newspaper articles or anything. So we know that they're collecting folklore students are collecting things about the Goatman.
Right.
Also, these other authors that I said that have written about the Goatman, they talk about, and I think there's no reason not to believe them. There's several of them. They all say no, there was a Goatman. What that exactly means seems to be up in the air, but there was the idea that there was a goat man out there. And so the goat man is usually described as a half man, half goat. This can vary, of course, like all folklore, but
Sure.
the most general description, if you look at many, many legends that seems to come together, is the goat man has the torso of a human, the head of a goat, the horns of a goat, the beard of a goat, and then the hooves of a goat, and usually like the crooked legs of a goat as well. But he stands upright. And then how he came to be. Well, actually, let's stay with the appearance here for a minute. So
Sure.
this
Yeah.
is this seems to when you see, like, even if you were just to go to Google, you're like half man, half goat. Some things that you've seen before come up. It might not be the
Yeah.
goat man, but a half man, half goat is actually kind of common. It's kind of like Pan of
Hmm.
ancient Greek lore, which would be the human on top, the goat on the bottom. You might also have Baphomet come up, or like basically the Western depiction of Satan, which is the opposite configuration usually, with the goat on the top and the human on the bottom. So it's a creepy thing to begin with, and
Sure.
also there's some scholarship out there that there seems to be perhaps even some natural human distaste for goats, not literal
Mm.
taste, but there seems to be
Right.
like we have terms like scapegoat, or even just if someone is a goat, it means they're like a lecherous man. So there's some also ancient cultural or historical cultural distaste for goats that's mixed in there as well. But anyway,
Yeah.
there's something about it,
Yeah.
and colonists, since John Smith raised goats in the Virginia colony, and
Hmm.
in which Maryland is now, or which Maryland would then become part of.
Right.
So there's the goats, there's goats in the area, and there's this goat man thing floating around. Anyway, and people in the area kind of know about it.
Right.
Then in 1971, in interestingly enough, the same folklore class that I take, a different professor, but the same folklore class that I eventually take to
Yeah.
become into this, but 40 years earlier, uh, there a student has to do that very traditional introduction to folklore collection project that so many intro to folklore programs do.
Right.
His name, reaching way back his memory here, but in my memory here, but George Lazama, I believe his name
Okay.
is. He does a collection, and he collects numerous variants of the Goatman legend in Prince George's County. Awesome. The first that I was ever able to find documented in writing evidence of this legend existing. So we have, I think, we don't like to throw around the word authentic in folklore, but I would say an authentic folk legend right there. And he collects
Yeah. Right.
that there is this legendary monster. What does the Goatman do? Like many
Right.
legendary monsters, he doesn't do a whole lot. Just the idea that he's out there is the main.
It's just there.
But he's associated with bridges. He's definitely associated with the lovers' lanes and the makeout places. He's known to
Yeah.
He's definitely associated with teenagers. Likes to throw bricks at teenagers' cars. He might, you might see his eyes glowing in the woods. He's definitely kind of back in the woods, back along the same isolated areas that the teenagers like to hang out. So we've got the Goatman, and then there's within that collection, we also hear these various origin stories. Like some people say that he was an old goat herder who loved his goats so much that when the goats died, he lost his mind and turned into a half goat himself. Then I think the one that's become more prominent these days is the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center is near there, and there's the idea that they were doing strange forbidden experiments on goats. I think this is probably the best known one, and that somehow, much like kind of like Spider-Man or something, there's some sort of infection into one of the researchers, and he becomes a goat, loses his mental stability, and proceeds into the woods. And then there were some other ideas. There's other little idea, like a man that was burned in a fire and somehow becomes. There's a lot of others in variants, but those are the two main ones I think that we find most often. Now, where this I think becomes interesting from the scholarly perspective, that is spring semester. We're thinking like students and like academics now. We're thinking in terms of semesters. That is spring semester 1971. Every folklorist knows, Camille, I'm sure you know this, that when you what time of year will you receive the most phone calls from journalists looking for quotes?
I don't want to get this wrong, but I feel like around that time, right after you get graduated, right?
A little bit further down, they need a human interest story, like October-ish.
Oh, Halloween. Hello, Camille.
Halloween.
Duh.
Sorry, I tricked you because I didn't start talking. Okay, because then we're going to go to fall semester. Fall semester. Every folklorist receives at least one phone call because the journalist needs a human interest story. Okay.
Right.
George Zlama puts this into the folklore. He gives it to his professor. The professors are just turning all the collection projects into the Folklife archives. A journalist named Karen Hostler. Yes, Karen Hostler.
Good memory.
On October 27th, 1971, instead of calling, or maybe she called, but if she did, the University of Maryland folklorist told her, go to the Maryland Folklife Archives. There's unlimited stories there for you. You can find so many stories there.
Yeah.
She goes in on October 27th and finds George Lazama's Goatman collection from just the previous semester. She, from her writing, from what I do from her writing, she's writing for the Prince George's County newspaper.
Okay.
She's obviously a local. She appears to already be aware of the legend. But she then is confirmed for her, and she has all this data now to work with. This dozen field collections that he was able to get. He's transcribed them. He's done all the classic folklore student things to them, and she reports in the Prince George's County newspaper for her Halloween human interest story.
Oh my God!
That there's a goat man creeping around Prince George's County. And so we have, if we want to go, if we're gonna go nerdy again, we now have what Richard Dorson. We had his folk legend earlier to what he now refers to as popular legends. where a legend that is going not purely through oral tradition, but is hitting this combination of oral tradition and multimedia,
Right.
and not just one or the other, but constantly going back between the two, and that's hitting this sort of dynamism that's going to then spread it at least across Prince George's County.
Oh yeah.
These days, probably all of our legends are quickly become popular legends because we have even more means of putting things through the media. But
Totally.
so that happens October 27th. On
Oh my
November
gosh.
1st, and so that goes just local newspaper, but a news
Nice. Yeah.
on November 1st, a dog, Ginger is her name. I can remember their name is Ginger. A dog is found decapitated next to the railroad, uh, next to a railroad, and those three teenagers who had heard the night before reported having heard something in the woods. They live kind of next to the woods where um, Karen has reported the goat man to lurk. They report hearing something the night before. They don't go out to investigate. They hear the dog yelp. The next day, they go out to investigate and they find the dog decapitated. They tell the original journalist, Karen Hostler, who reports
Okay.
this as well. Now, the follow up story that the goat man isn't just out there, but that he's active and he's killing causes a panic, although
Oh
kind of an
jeez.
excited panic
Well, of
among
course.
teenagers. That
Totally.
then, and this is when we start getting the best reporting from these authors who've looked into it, who are mostly local residents. Markup Sasnick. There's also a local priest named Father Joe who has a really good blog,
Mm,
and he writes about this time, and it's this very exciting time. We just go into pure ostension mode. We're going into legend
right.
tripping,
Right.
because it's like, okay, the every Friday you go to school, you go to the football game, and it's goat man hunting time.
Yeah. Yeah.
The point that the frenzy is so much that and obviously, so now this legend is spreading orally, and then
Jeez.
also it's like, hey, is this really true? I mean, I saw it in the papers. Of course it's true. It was in the
Yeah.
papers. It's true. So it's what that we're getting verification
Oof.
through sources uh,
Right.
that's probably spreading this legend even further among the people who are telling it and hearing it. That Karen Hostler then has to write a third story. Her third
Oh my
story
gosh.
is that the real monsters of Fletchertown Road are the teenagers who are overrunning it with beer can. They're stopped in their cars in the middle of the
Sure.
road, running out to find goat. Apparently, there's beer cans all over the place. They're running
Jeez
into private
Louise.
property. So this period, which is just this really short period in 1971, when the legend was first collected, Karen
Right.
Hostler references it. There is then some ostension, followed by more and more ostension. Is really when this legend takes off, and we can be kind of sure of this, that this is really its big moment, because there was another folklorist. I actually don't know. I actually believe this was not the class that that George Lozamo was in, but the state
Okay.
folklorist of Maryland, George Carey, in 1971 had just published two books on Maryland folklore and folk life. He doesn't mention the goat man in them. So this is very much like a local regional legend
Huh.
before 1971.
Yeah.
By 2000, I don't have the date memorized, but by 2000 something, whenever
Oh.
Weird Maryland comes out, the Weird series, like
Oh,
there's Weird of every single state.
of course.
Goatman is the title page on Weird
Yes.
Weird Maryland. So in this short period of time, we have this cryptid that takes off from being unknown outside this tiny little area up to being the best known. Um, just because of this little incident. Then what also should be mentioned after that? Who picks it up next? The Washington Post.
Oh, jeez.
And how can they not? They have this whole
Of course.
this whole thing going down in combination of three different towns that are all, they're not right next to each other, but they're all like within a half an hour of each other, of the Fletchertown Road, Lotsford Road, and and Mitchellville, where it starts out.
Right.
So there's three towns kind of all near each other. They all have this Goatman craze going. It eventually gets picked up by the Washington Post. Now, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, we go back into the folk life archives. Now, this becomes one of the most prominently collected uh,
Whoa.
folklore legend scholarship collections by undergraduates for the next 20 years. It doesn't die off
Dang.
until the 90s. Which town and which road it is in varies. What is connected
Okay.
to varies, but
Sure.
the uh the legend itself sticks around. It only seems to die off when it eventually then becomes more popular to put it into popular culture. And I
Mm.
think with my theory being there wasn't a whole lot of there wasn't a whole lot of narrative to the goat man to begin with. There's kind of like this is kind of what he looks like. This is kind of where he
Right.
lives. Maybe this is
Right.
his origin. Maybe he does some mean things like throw bricks or have an axe or chase
Sure.
kids. But what does he do? The story was that the real legend was that there was a guy named Goatman and he's out there. So that's what we could often find. Now we could also sometimes find
Mm.
folklorists. What folklorists would be interested in if like I need to make this story better, but I don't know what this guy does. We would frequently find in those collections you can find people trying to find things for the goat man to do. This is also the same time as like Jan Brun Van's urban legend collections are coming out. Those stories seem to have been known in this area too, because the goat man just gets combined to be like the protagonist or the villain, really, in the
Right.
boyfriend's death. You know,
Oh,
boyfriend's
totally.
death or
Yeah.
Hookman or any of these. Just add the goat man as the character to the other well-known urban legends, and you have
Right.
more of a narrative. You have the interesting character combined with the narrative. Um, so the Goat Man of Prince George's County. That's the start. I have more, but that's who the Goat
Oh my
Man
God.
is.
What a masterclass, David. I feel like you just gave everybody a masterclass, not only in the Goat Man and your understandings of him and his existence, but of cryptozoology in general, right? Like this idea of legends and legend tripping and popular legends, urban legends, how stories get transmitted, what that does to society, right? Like the popular crazes with teenage kids, like it's such a great, like, fruitful story, I feel like, and I think that's what makes this specific entity, the Goat Man, so freaking cool. And like you said, you're right, there's not to your understanding, right, this narrative, this story, right, this like cohesive story necessarily. There's just a lot of tidbits that people pick out, right? Like, I think he kills, I think he's bad, I think he, lives around the bridge, he's secluded, a lot of people don't see him very often, right? Picking up these pieces and, motifs or tropes or what have you of the story. But that's also kind of what makes him more menacing and right, because
Right.
he's secretive and you're like, I don't know when I'll see this guy, how I'll see this guy, right? Like, it's kind of exciting. And I love the hype. I love the hype. And I love just the pride I think that people from Maryland have for the Goat Man. It's so
I
cool.
think that's a real thing. I think that's definitely a real thing. This idea of regional pride in one's
Yes.
cryptids. I think an interview question I'm frequently asked is like, are people actually afraid of these monsters? And I think there's contextual situations where they probably are, and I think it may have been more prominent in the past than in the present. But there's definitely
Yeah.
people who are proud of their
Yes.
regional monsters. I mean, the number of T-shirts and cocktails and stuffed animals and just various things like that,
Yeah.
and festivals that you'll find
Yes.
on the Goatman or on the Jersey Devil or on Bigfoot or
Yes.
Mothman or any of the. These are just I'm just naming the ones that are around the area where I grew up. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely something that is fear a factor, maybe, but there's other factors going on as well, both
Right.
pride and commercialism playing into these.
Yes. And on that note too, David, I'm curious as to why do you think there is this, like, love of the fear, right? Or hype around the idea of getting scared, especially for teenagers, right? In this specific context. Why do you think that happens? These types of crazes where you tell each other, you legend trip, you go try it for yourself, you go searching for something, in this case, right? The goat man. Why do you think that
I
exists
think there's a
for
certain
that age range?
romanticism to it. You hear, and I think even scholars do theorize that like these legends and legend trips are often an excuse to perform behaviors that otherwise perhaps you wouldn't have a reason to
Mm-hmm.
do. And I think I agree with that. And then with cryptids specifically, with the monster hunters, I think there's also a little bit of romanticism that you kind of like in like a local Indiana Jones style. You're out there hunting. You're trying to find something. That needs to be in a museum. You're out there trying to find something that
Needs to be in an
it needs
archive.
to be in an it needs to be in an archive, or really probably with non folklorists, like that needs to be captured in a picture on my iPhone. Like
Right,
it.
right.
So I think there's definitely the standard answer to why teenagers legend trip, but I also like this idea of a certain romanticism that there are still unanswered questions out there. There's still something
Yeah.
a little beyond the veil, and that people are attracted to trying to investigate those beings or those questions for themselves.
Right.
And the cryptid is a very a fun way to do that. Now, I also have a second answer to that question.
Yeah.
So I actually wrote a follow up. So I did my original Goatman research, getting Maryland's goat, but I wrote a follow up article as well, the Goatman of Prince George's County. Actually, I don't even know. I think that's what its title is. Something. The point of the article
Amazing.
was the psychological interpretation of what was going on here, because I had the same question as you. What? Why are people so interested in in this, or at least why were they so interested in this at that moment? There's a lot going on in 1971. It's not to say that this was changing people's lives or anything, but there's a lot going on in 1971, and from what we could see from the historical record, is people seemed to take note of it.
Mm.
Why was that? Why did they take note of it, and why did they take note of this particular monster at this particular time? And I kind of just
Yes.
stumbled upon the answer, or at least what I think the answer was, while I was doing my research.
Yeah.
The 70s was a terrifying time for a lot of people, especially for people from Prince George's County. The world was undergoing, and this is like right after, literally right after the decade of the 60s. We're in the early 70s. It's a tumultuous time. And
Right.
it's also a very scary time for people that live right in this exact area where Goatman is seen to live, right outside the Beltway, right outside the Washington, D.C. Beltway. This was at
Yeah.
once a very rural place, a rural place
Right.
that was becoming modernized. And if you look at all the different reports, this always seems to be mentioned, even if it's not being told as the catalyst for Goatman. It
Sure.
seems that Prince George's County, right at the same time, was undergoing a sort of urbanization, because Washington, D.C.
Mm.
is a very important place. Not a whole lot of people who work in Washington, D.C. necessarily live there. They live around it and they commute in.
Sure.
And it seems that if we look closely at the characteristics, the deeds, the attributes of the Goatman, and we simultaneously look at the FBI crime files of that same decade, one thing that I noticed is all of the bad deeds that Goatman is associated with are the same bad deeds that are suddenly beginning to plague themselves in rural Prince George's County,
Oh
supposedly
man.
flooding out of urban Washington, D.C. So we have murder, we have
Mm-hmm.
property destruction, we have various crimes against children being teenagers, but we have various crimes against children or minors. um and we have general vagrancy, or generally itinerants, people that don't necessarily have a home there,
Right.
through. Perhaps,
Right.
and we have almost certain reports that people were beginning to live in the woods, and that people found these people generally frightening. Um, so all these ranging from nuisances to outright scary things like murder. In fact, we also find that one of these roads, Lotsford Road, that the Goatman is associated with, and this is quite gruesome, was actually the dumping ground for murders from Washington, D.C. And like large urban cities are known to have these places. Like New York City has the East
Right.
River, Las Vegas
Right.
has this, they're like holes in the surrounding desert. Baltimore has Lincoln Park, Lincoln Park. There's places that like people are known to
Oh my
dump murder
gosh.
victims. The places that
Right.
murder victims were dumped was exactly the same place that Goatman was known to haunt. It's like, a dark, out of the way place that's near an urban place, but it's far enough away that the body won't be found for a while. Perhaps it won't be found at all, and you can't
Jeez.
quickly associate it with anybody's address or with any particular person. So my theory here, when I was looking at these two things, it was also the time of the rise of the serial killer, that
Sure.
what we're seeing is kind of like a psychological embodiment of all this other stuff that people were
Yeah.
afraid of already. And they were kind of
Yeah.
melding all of that onto this particular Goatman. That's not to say that the Goatman didn't exist, because a folklorist would not
Right.
say that. There's probably honest witnesses. Maybe they really did see something. But
Yeah.
why did it stir up such a reaction? We can then put other psychological feelings that were about other fears and anxieties in general of the changing geographical, the changing geography, the changing times, and put it all onto this one Goatman. And it makes him more fearsome, because he is then the embodiment of the things that people are actually afraid of.
Oh my gosh. That's wild. That is so interesting. And that's always such a cool thing I think about monsters and cryptids, like specifically, right? They embody the reflection of society in some way, the fears of
Right.
society in some way. You can see that, right? You can pick those things apart. And I didn't know that about Maryland. I didn't know that about that specific location. It makes complete sense, right? The rise of the serial killer, the age of the 70s, like there are so many different things happening. Oh my gosh, though. That's haunting. It truly is, right? And I think that also kind of justifies what we said earlier about this idea of monster um can kind of become something not even literal in a
Hmm,
way.
hmm.
It could just be this fear, right, that feeds on
Right. Right.
everybody, probably at this time in that region. Oh my gosh, but so nonetheless frightening,
Frightening.
right?
And I think also it probably
So
eventually
frightening.
explains the death of Goatman. Not that he died, but then in the
Yeah,
'90s,
yeah,
when it seems to transition, like you said, away from being this more fearsome entity to
yeah,
something that's more like a symbol of pride, local identity.
right,
That seems to kind of, in the late '90s, we finally moved away from the early '70s, and we were into something new at that point. And and
yeah,
then all of a sudden there could be other reasons as well, that suddenly we're not finding these
yeah,
collections anymore. Maybe they stopped asking for that. Maybe it stopped being emphasized. But yeah, well, that there was this period of time where Goatman makes sense to a community, and now I think he still makes sense to a community, but he makes sense to a community in a very different way. And that community might be much more broad now. It might be the whole United States. People like you and me who are interested in cryptids in general.
right. They just get manifested a little bit differently,
Right.
and it's fun to see, like you said, the idea of pride in these creatures now, right? People see them as pinnacles of I don't know, just like getting themselves out of really hard times.
Hmm, hmm.
Right? They go to these monsters, these creatures. They tell these stories as a sense of escape, right? To get lost into something else. And I think that's what's so interesting. I think we also see a rise, at least recently in the 2000s, we see a rise of no, the bad guy isn't, the Goatman, for example, or whatever cryptid. They're just there to warn us that something bad is going to happen,
Right.
right? Like if you see them, it's a warning, right? And I think you hear that a lot more too, which is fascinating. Like, don't worry, they're not the bad guy, but it's probably not good luck that you saw, right?
Right.
This creature, um, which is also just like a fascinating thing. How monsters, you can befriend monsters so deeply, on such a deep personal level, you know. Um,
And I agree with that. And I'm working on something, and you are part of it, Camille, and called Monsters Today, where we're trying to look at like what we're doing, where's this all going next, and what you just said. That's got to be one of the number one focuses, because that seems to be where things are going. I mean, they're already there, but that needs
sure,
to be
sure.
addressed by people who are interested in legendary monster scholarship. Like how did that transition occur? And
Yes,
what do we have to say about that?
right. I mean, and it's even fascinating for you, David, right? Like, obviously, I know Bloody Mary and the Goatman aren't the same, but right, that transition, into like being like, I really want to study though this thing that scares people, that instilled this fear on people. I want to see why.
Mhm,
I want to
mhm,
see
mhm.
how. I want to, right. I want to break it down.
Right, right.
And I think that's what's so cool about monsters too. In that way, they have layers to break down. They can reflect so much about so much in right recent years, based on society, based on you as a person. People also choose to hear the legend, in a different way, and maybe that's consciously or subconsciously, right? Like they hold on to pieces of the legend that they're like, oh yeah, I like this. I'm gonna tell this
Mhm,
part. This
mhm,
part's gonna stay in
mhm.
my brain. I like that one. Or maybe I'm gonna have a little fun with my cousins, for example, and change things a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit, so that they get a little scared, right? It's cool to see that growth and to see where Goatman has the trajectory of Goatman's kind of narrative and story, is really cool. It's fascinating in and of it. It's a legend, right? In and of
It's a legend
itself.
in and of
Just that.
itself. Yeah, and what you're saying, yeah, really intrigues me. Richard Dorson had that thesis that like Americans have never been scared of monsters. That the idea of being scared of monsters is an old world thing, and that
Mm,
we've always used them in other ways.
yeah.
And I feel like that's probably mostly true. I think we see some examples where people seem to be somewhat in North America, where people seem to be somewhat afraid of monsters, and definitely in the Western Hemisphere, examples where people are afraid of monsters. But this idea that they are primarily not an instrument of fear, but but provide other
Mm,
functions for us. I mean, that's a
mm.
fascinating idea that I think we need to continue to explore as American folklorists.
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's that's what makes us, I think, stick to this field, right? Is seeing that excitement in other people and hearing what they and hearing about their favorite monsters and how they guided them to wherever they are in life now. And you said something very interesting when we were kind of going back and forth figuring out what monster you chose. And you said, right, point blank period, that Goatman basically changed the trajectory of your
Yeah.
life, right? It completely. And I know you've touched on it a little bit throughout, this episode so far, but I'm curious if you can kind of expand a little bit more on that, how you see it now, where you are in your life now.
Yeah. So I think before I even get into that, I think something you said really struck me. Like when it's so interesting to ask people about their favorite monsters. I think maybe even um, a step further for some people, not who your favorite monster is, but like what monster chose you. Because like I don't know if I could look at which every legendary monster in the United States. I think there's probably ones that are more interesting than Goatman. But I
Mm,
grew up in Maryland, and I
right.
lived for many years in Prince George's County, and so in a way, the Goatman chose me, and I bet that's the case for many people. That is like, is it their favorite? Well, it's their favorite because they know the most about it, but it's more like a relative. You can't choose your family, you can't choose your cryptids. The Because
Yeah.
it's the one that you're gonna know the most about, at least at the beginning when you first become interested in this field. I would think is
Totally.
probably the one that you had to grow up with, the one that your family knows about, the one that your geographic area knows about. And so for me, that was Goatman. Yeah, how's Goatman changed changed my life? I think, and I guess I never really sat down and thought about that, but for me, it all, yeah, I guess I owe a lot to him, because I
Mm,
think he helped me realize I was interested in folklore, and then he helped me see the value of being a researcher in folk life archives. It's more like I've just follows my whole scholarly experience, and then I did an article on the Goatman. And then because I did the article on the Goatman, the History Press contacted me and asked me if I'd like to write a book on Maryland legends
So
because I'd
awesome.
written essentially one chapter. So it was like a sample. And so then I was
Yeah.
able to do books. So it just keeps growing and growing. And then because I did that one day, even if it was like 10 years later, I do a case book on monsters, and I'd never thought about it like that until you asked me. But yeah, I guess it all started. If the Goatman didn't exist, I wouldn't have had any spark to start that fire.
Yeah.
So in a way, I owe like my whole career to the Goatman,
Mm.
because being able to do those things are the things you have to do to
Yeah.
apply to be an assistant professor, and then apply to be an associate professor. It just kind of helped me along the way. So I did other things as well, but he was kind of always always there for me. Never
God,
thought about how much I owed him until you asked me that.
that's so beautiful. And I just love that you said too, like he chose you. Especially like I get so excited about the metaphors of these guys. And you mentioned earlier, right? Like there's a lot of different iterations of Goatman in popular culture, in literature, right? If you think of Pan, if you think of, right, a lot of other different entities. But in a lot of ways, like Pan's Labyrinth is my favorite movie in the world. I love, oof, that is my movie. And
Holds
it's
the
interesting,
little
right?
trivia before we move on. Holds the record
Oh,
for the longest standing ovation. I just learned this the other day. For the longest standing ovation of all time at the Cannes Film Festival, where every single movie gets like a 7 to 10 minute. Uh, it
yeah.
got 22. It's the only movie to ever got a 22-minute standing ovation.
I did not know that.
Yep, it holds the record.
That's
Yep,
amazing. That's so well deserved. To I know I'm biased, but I'm like, yes, good,
22
good.
minutes.
22
I couldn't
minutes.
clap for 22 minutes, but barely
I
the
know my back would
audience
have hurt.
clap. I mean, it is a really good movie.
Brilliant movie. So good.
But
And
sorry to cut you off for cocktail trivia.
no, no, now that is a beautiful part of my brain now. I'm very proud of that. That's great. No, no, I was just saying, right, like that was the Goatman I grew up with at a very young age, and I had always seen he was frightening. That character is frightening.
Mm-hmm.
He's ancient, and he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't even speak your same tongue, right? He's just a little different, that uncanny valley kind of
Yeah,
vibe. But he guides the main character. That's his kind of role. He is a guide. He is a messenger in that way. You don't know that
right,
really until the
right.
end, but you realize that was his role. And I feel like, right, we were talking about Goatmen and cryptids, right? This idea of the bridge, you having to make a choice to cross it or not, um, despite seeing what's there. I think, I don't know, I feel like the Goatman is so metaphorical for so many different ways, depending on how you want to take it. But I think it's great that he's guided you for so long
Without, like you said, without me even knowing.
without you even knowing. You may not know, right? And that's what's so fun about them.
That's that
Okay.
is incredible.
Unfortunately, right, we're getting to the last. I know we could talk about this. We really could, David. I
Endlessly.
know we could talk about this for a long
We could
time.
get into the Blair Witch Project, which I believe
I
is
know.
just it's a Blair Witch Project just down the hall from down the
Oh.
road. Actually, it's pretty far down, but yeah, I feel like the Blair Witch Project owes itself to the Goatman as well.
Ooh.
And
Ooh.
actually, I get a sense that when I see people, they're like, "I'm going to do a Goatman." If you go on YouTube, there's like a million film students that
Sure.
they're gonna do films about the Goatman, and some of them have. I feel
Yeah.
a Blair Witch vibe from all of them. Interestingly, just because two
Sure.
things in the same area. Burkittsville is actually closer to where I grew up. It's
Okay.
definitely it's Western Maryland rather than Capital Maryland. But yeah, we could get into that. We could get into the comic books. We could get into the X
Oh.
Files, which did a Goatman. But hey, all for another time.
Offer no. Don't worry, we'll have you back. Don't worry, we're gonna have to have a part two because his reach is large. But on that note, I was gonna ask you, do you have a favorite Goatman in popular culture? Whether that's like the Maryland version, right, or just in general.
That's a good question. I think okay, so my favorite Goatman as far as depiction And I
Okay.
wish I had the book here. The title page on Weird Maryland. Weird Maryland. I like sometimes I don't like that they don't seem to like cite their sources or even give you a last name, so you can't follow up on the things that they're telling
Right.
you. On the other hand, some of their stuff really is good, and that's why
True.
I don't like that they don't cite their sources because I don't think it's all fabrication.
Right.
I would like to, sometimes I was like I'd like to follow up more on this, but it's just there's not a way to do it always.
Yeah.
And then maybe other parts are I don't know, but their art is it can be very very good. And so on the title page, which I often reference as like you know, the pinnacle goat man, that he went from being unknown in the state folklorists two books about Maryland in 1971
Right.
to being the title page in Weird Maryland. It's him standing on the beltway on a bridge, like on the beltway,
Yeah.
throwing sheep, I think, off the bridge into the water. And it's just such
Oh my
it's just
gosh.
such a ridiculous scene, but also kind of accurate to the various motifs that come up around the goat man. That I love the image. I love how sinister the image is. Maybe if maybe I can like send you a link to it that you can put in the
Please.
notes. And
Please.
but then I also love that like that was his moment. He made it. He went from being
Yeah.
unknown through the various folk processes and legend processes to being the title page guy. Boom, right there.
Wow.
Throwing sheep, I think throwing sheep off of a bridge into off the beltway.
What a depiction. Like, that's so great. That's so freaking fantastic. And, just so, like, what is going on? And I think that's what makes it so exciting. I'm sure that begged readers to read if they had never heard of the Goat Man
Right,
before.
right. How can you
So
not?
you're right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. How can you
You
not?
got to find out why this thing is throwing throwing
Right.
sheep into
What?
the.
Marilyn, what's going on? Exactly, exactly. Well, David, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm going to ask you, do you find that the Goat Man is scary?
Hmm. I think in the 70s, in the early 70s, when you first heard about it, you don't have the same amount of access to social media or the internet. You only just first heard about it. It's apparently verified. It's already a scary time. It's already a scary time. There's a
Yeah.
lot of things going on in the world, a lot of tumult. Um, the the papers appear to be reporting, especially if you haven't read them yourself, just that you're being told. The
Right?
papers appear to be reporting that there's a goat man living in the woods. Um, Enough people seem to believe it that they're actually going out there trying to look for the thing, and it apparently has a kill count. It's killed at least one dog, and I'm sure that story spun. I mean, we know it did
Oh,
by the
yeah.
time we had the next collection, but within the few weeks, I'm sure it had spun to more sinister acts than that. I think I think the Goat Man was probably legitimately scary at that time. I think so, because I think there was probably some idea that there was really something out there, whatever, however unexplainable it
Yeah.
was. Is the Goat Man scary today? I think no. I mean, my
Okay.
reason for that is I was like rereading my own writing to prepare to talk to you today.
Yeah.
I read something that I couldn't even remember writing, and it's like, oh, that's a good
Oh,
point. That's a
wow.
good point. Her, who is myself in a past version of myself, I wrote down that I thought the Goat Man of today was not the Goat Man of the past. The Goat Man of today was the child of the Goat Man of the past. That the Goat Man of the
Mm.
past eventually bore the Goat Man of today. The Goat Man of the past
Ah,
is this perhaps a more frightening, more sinister version. The Goat Man of today is this more popular, symbolic, maybe even point of pride among people who are interested in this sort of thing. So I think it's best to maybe think of it as like the father and the son. The father was probably scary. I definitely have to lean on the
yeah.
people who were there, and they seem to say that he was scary or he was at least
Right.
thrilling. And the thrill, part of the thrill, I'm sure, was the fear. But the Goat Man today is I don't know if he's cuddly the way like the Mothman is cuddly to some people,
Right.
Chupacabra is cuddly to some people, but I don't think he's frightening. I think he fulfills other needs today of people, with fear not necessarily being one of them. Maybe a little menace in there, but scary no longer.
I love that. I know this isn't what you mean, but when you talk about like the family history, the lineage, right? It's almost like generational
Hmm.
trauma in a way, right?
Yeah.
Like of parents and children, right? It's like maybe he had to be tough and maybe he had to be scary and fearful, or people, feared him for a reason. And now it's like the child, right? Accepting that, understanding
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
realizing what brought him here and
That's a good
changing the
point.
narrative a little bit. It's cute. It's like it's a
He
cool
can
family
become a better
tree.
man than his father was.
Yeah, a better, in his best, doing his
Yes,
best.
his best life in popular
I love
culture.
it. I love
But
it.
and then like where does it go from here? I haven't, because I moved away from Maryland. I
Yeah,
haven't been as involved in like where is this going right now. I'll keep up with like I'll have a Google whatever it's called alert for when Goatman things come out. So I'm aware of the popular culture stuff, but what's happening
sure,
on the ground with Goatman, I'm not. My sense is like oh nothing's happening, but I could be wrong
sure.
because I'm not there and I haven't really been um, among that community. Maybe there's a something coming next.
That's amazing. Ah, what fun. What a brilliant time to be in your position, though.
True,
I don't know.
true.
I feel like that's great.
Yeah.
Well, David, do you think that the goat man is a monster? Why or why not?
Yes, I think the Goatman. I have a very broad definition of monster, but at least the Goatman of the past was a legendary monster. The
Yeah.
Goatman of today, a popular legendary monster. But yes, the Goatman of the
Yeah.
past, I think, is an excellent example of a traditional folk legendary monster. Maybe even the best example, because unlike some examples we can give of like zombies and vampires, he
Sure.
doesn't seem to have ancient origins of that extent. It's that
Mm.
emergent folklore in the 60s and 70s that folklorists, the folklorists love. Um, so yes, an excellent example of a folk legendary monster
Yeah.
that had his time. And then if you were to ask me like is the goat man of 2024 a legendary monster, I probably would still say yes, but this one that we
Yes.
went over with today, the born, or at least the one that came to our attention in 1971, perfect
Oh,
example of a
definitely.
legendary monster.
Truly, I'm serious. Like a masterclass. Like it's so fruitful, his story, and I love it. I think you hit it right on the
And it's
head.
also, I think,
Definitely.
something that for any folklorists who are listening, it's also the story of folklorists, and something and something we need to be especially careful of the reflexivity in that
Mm.
the story of the goat band shows that the story of these legendary monsters is often at least half the story of folklorists or folklore adjacent people who are pursuing that legendary monster.
Mm.
We are just as much in the tale as
Yeah.
the monster itself. George Lazama and Karen Hostler are just as important in the goat man as the goat man, because you would not know about the goat man if it wasn't for
Nope.
those two. People would know about it, but you and I
Sure.
would not know about it.
Probably not. They were that platform, that secret
Yep, yep.
platform.
That we needed to hear what is a really small local community legend go
Yeah.
by.
Yeah. So cool. What a fascinating story. A creature, monster, all of it. Just it's so cool.
Friend, mentor, what?
Friend, mentor, son.
That's what I've got now. That's Camille.
Yeah. 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 Well, David, why do you think monsters are so important, right? I obviously know, I can tell from our hours speaking with each other. But I'm curious if you can put in a few words, right? Why are monsters important? Why is talking about monsters important? Reading about them, researching about them? What is it about them?
So I think I think there's so many different ways you can go with this, and I think that's why, Camille, this is an excellent question that I'm you're sure to conclude with. So from my perspective, from my academic or scholarly perspective, monsters are worth studying because they are imbued with human values, and we can use them to assess various topics, or various, yeah, let's just say topics that can't otherwise be discussed as
Yeah.
easily. So when anytime you see a monster, um, these won't all necessarily come into play, but you can definitely check for, when I see this monster, am I noting some sort of commentary by the local community on otherness?
Mm-hmm.
Am I noting some sort of commentary by the community on some sort of sociological or geographic change? Is there something that's changing in the community that this
Yeah.
entity is, the values of that community being placed on this creature? Is this some sort standing in? Is this monster standing in for some sort of local or regional pride of some sort?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
is that somehow at play here?
Right.
Or the fourth one that I usually like to check is there some sort of commercialism at
Hmm.
play in here, which is very as American as it gets. If you have something that's popular, it might be worth trying to make a buck off of it. So the anytime that we have a monster, at least from a scholarly folklore perspective, in addition to these might be honest reports of
Yeah.
something a witness has seen, um, it's always, even if we don't monster hunt,
Oh, hi, balloons.
I liked it. Even if
I know, it's
even if
great.
we don't monster hunt the way that like monster hunters do, we do hunt tradition, and you can find tradition in that. It takes time and effort and care to keep these legends about these monsters going. So that's worth checking on. And then in addition to that, we can always check on, is this saying something about otherness? Is this saying something about geographic or sociological change? Is this saying something about local or regional pride? Is this saying something about commercialism?
They're perfect ways to check the climate of whatever's
Exactly.
going around at the
Exactly. Well
time.
put.
So great, and it's so fun. Oh, I love it. I love monsters so much, and I think you said it perfectly, totally perfectly. Okay, well, very last question, David, and this one is kind of silly, some people like to think, but I think it's a fun thought to have. But say, and you can decide the location, whether you're just, relaxing in your New York home, or maybe you take a trip down to Maryland for some reason or another. And all of a sudden, you are face to face with the Goatman of Maryland. What would you do? What would you do? What would you say? How would you react? What would happen in that moment?
That's a great question. Yeah, because there's so many questions I've asked about the Goat Man. The idea of being able to ask him the answers himself never even crossed. Yeah, never crossed my mind that that was a possibility. I think. Yeah. Okay. So, right, old school folklorists are always in the search for origins, right? And then they ultimately gave
Totally.
up that because origins are impossible to find. But if you can ask the
Always.
guy himself,
Yeah.
where did this all begin? It might be a legitimate question if the originator himself could tell you. So I think I ultimately would first and foremost like to know, where did you come from? Why is there a
Yeah.
goat man of Prince George's County?
Right.
Why is there a half man? Why am I speaking to a half man, half goat? How did this happen? Because that does play a lot into the legend. I'd like an answer to
Yeah.
that. And then I guess secondly, I would need to know, why did you do these things? Why did you kill Ginger?
Mm.
Why did you decapitate that
Yeah.
dog? Why are you lurking in the woods messing with these lovers lane teenagers? So first off,
Right.
where did you come from? Second, why are you doing this? And I guess third, because folklore's like threes, where did you go? What
He disappeared a bit.
why did you leave? Why did you leave us?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like I see your son is still around, the popular version of you, but the original version. Why did you leave us? So
Yeah.
I would
I'd
love
love
to
to
know those three
know.
things from his own mouth. It's not clear whether the goat man speaks. The variants are like
Mm,
usually like what do goats do? He brays, yeah, he brays more
yeah.
than he eats.
Yes,
So
yes.
I'm not sure if he'd be able to respond, but if I could talk to him, that's what I would ask.
Once again, spoken like a true scholar, David. I love that you're like, yep, I'm going to get some field work.
I need a third article on this.
Yeah. So, guys, guess what? Ran into him. This is what I found.
Clear all this up.
Yeah, yeah. Fill all the holes. That's so fantastic. That is so cool. And, not to say like I hope you do run into him because I know that can be terrifying.
No, I'd be
But
down with it. People have asked me that before. Like, would you be willing to see a ghost? Like, I'd love to see a ghost, and
like, let's
I'd
go.
love to see Goatman. Let's do it.
Yeah, yeah. That is so awesome. Well, David, thank you so much for doing this and for being a part of the show. I think you add such an amazing depth to the world of monsters and Goatman as well. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for setting this up, Camille. Thanks for having me. This was great.
Of course, and we'll always have you back for part 2.
Look forward to it.
This episode of Floaties for Krakens was written and recorded by me, Camille Maria Acosta. A monstrous thank you to Dr. David Puglia for such a brilliant interview. A big thank you to Michael Kosman for producing a stellar episode, and a huge thank you to Natalie Hedberg for designing such a phenomenal logo. And music for the show was also written and produced by me, with a special appearance by my tata, Toby Acosta. Thank you all so much for tuning into today's show. It truly means everything. If you have questions or curiosities about the research or media referenced in today's episode, everything will hopefully be in the description box. And you can find us on our website and our socials, links in the description as well. Anyway, thanks again for being here, everyone. And just a reminder, it's okay to be afraid of the monster, but it's also okay to love the heck out of it too. Keep being monstrous and keep shining bright.